by about 10 years after the 1895 partitioning of D'Urville, the native land court was being used to allow land to be sold if at least a third of the owners agreed. One Robert John William, or Bismarck King Turner, became an owner of some land at Port Hardy on D'Urville Island, among other places in the area. Bismarck King Turner, in a letter in the National Archives, states that he was leasing Puangiangi from 1920, and the letter gives us postal address as Hamilton Bay near Titiwaka. So it's reasonable to conclude that Mr. King Turner was farming in several locations, perhaps with a base in Hamilton Bay, and was using Puangiangi as seasonal grazing. Come 1927, sales on D'Urville had been happening for 20 years or more, accelerated by the Native Land Act 1909, which allowed meetings of owners to be called to vote on selling any property where there were more than 10 owners. Such meetings had a quorum of only 5 owners, regardless of the total number of owners or the proportion of shares owned by those present at the meeting. But the small islands around here were among the last to be sold because they were effectively a single, widely scattered parcel owned by all of the original 79 Ngāti Koara owners. However, in March 1927, the islands were partitioned by the Native Land Court on application by Mokau Kawharu. The owners appeared to want partitions so that they might also get on and sell the land, no doubt encouraged by lessees such as Bismarck King Turner. At partition, the owners agreed among themselves as to who would get each island, and the Ruruku family became substantial shareholders in Tinui across the way. Puangiangi had many owners at that point, and some of the names are still quite familiar in the area today. By the date of that partition, at least 6 of the owners were already dead and only a few lived locally. Te Oti Tekateka and Tiemi Haromi were outside the rohe but nearby at Okoha, and Tara Wirihana was in Canvastown. The others were scattered widely, but many of the minor shareholders were up in Taranaki at Manaia. In December 1926, Bismarck King Turner applied to the Native Land Court to have Puangiangi sold by calling of a meeting of the owners and to vote on the proposals that he buy the island at either 5% above government valuation or to formalise the current lease at £10 per year. 2 of the owners were working with him in March 27 to get this meeting called and get that deal across the line. However, other owners weren't. In May 27, Mr. King Turner wrote to the Registrar of the Native Land Court and stating he'd signed an informal lease with 2 of the owners, but became aware that Percy Douglas Hope of French Pass had also signed a 1-year lease with 3 other owners, which gave Mr. Hope the right to buy or to have a 21-year lease. Both men had small flocks of sheep on Puangiangi, and Mr. King Turner wanted to know if he was allowed to impound Mr. Hope's sheep. The Registrar of the Native Land Court wrote back within a week saying, "Don't take those sheep, and by the way, your leases are not valid at all." King Turner was asking at that point if he could at least muster his own sheep into the yards that he'd built. So we know that the sheep yards, which will come along shortly, had been built by about the 1920s. In August 27, the island had a government valuation of £100, and the court advised that a meeting of owners would require 2 people to be present and at least 3 others to have provided their proxies, and so some of the owners were busy trying to gain those proxies. Mr. Hope was also trying to buy the island through his alliance with some of the other owners, and this came to a head at a meeting in Picton in September 1928. There were 4 owners present and 2 others had given their proxies. Someone made a note in the file that I accessed in National Archives, adding up the interests of the owners present and represented by proxy, and they did account for the great majority of shares in the island. Neither Mr. Hope nor Mr. King Turner was successful in buying the island. John Arthur Elkington came forward as a buyer. Mr. King Turner increased his offer to £175, but Mr. Elkington was given by the meeting 2 months to come up with a purchase price of £195. King Turner asked that his cheque for £175 be held on file and cashed in the event that Mr Elkington couldn't complete the conditional sale. John Arthur Elkington was a grandson of Roma Hoira Te Ruruku, and he lived nearby at Whareatia on D'Urville Island. The owners wanted the highest price, but I think they must have been quite pleased that it was going to go to a son of Ngāti Koata. A board, which I think has had its modern day equivalent in the State Advances Corporation, although I may be wrong on that point, was prepared to lend the money to Mr Elkington, secured partly over some family land at Manaia in Taranaki. But there was a lot of complication with the land in Taranaki because it had been in a state recently and it wasn't clear which title referred to which part of the land, and so it was a little bit difficult to work out what the land offered as security actually was. Representations were made by a local solicitor that Mr Elkington was good for the money and was a good payer of a lease he held. Things seem to be on track at this point. In November 28, solicitors in Wellington were engaged to draw up documents for a loan of £250 for 5 years at 8%, reducible to 6.5% for prompt payment. However, there was still complication with the title in Taranaki, and the owners of Puangiangi were pressing for completion. Douglas Hope's agent wrote to the judge offering £182, and some of the owners were also writing in November 28 to the judge of the Native Land Court, reminding him that the 2 months to find finance was up, and they wanted to sell to Bismarck King Turner if Arthur Elkington could not complete immediately. The complications in Taranaki ground on, and they gave up in December 1928, and Mr Elkington was advised that his application for a loan was unsuccessful for the final time. Was Mr Elkington treated fairly? I don't know. From the board's viewpoint, they'd received instruction to turn down 2 cash offers in exchange for a conditional one. They'd given an extension, and they were under pressure on the owners to call time and sell to an underbidder who'd offered a good percentage above government valuation. In January 29, one of the owners was getting insistent, writing to the court, "We've waited long enough for that money and cannot wait any longer." On the 17th of January 29, Bismarck King Turner wrote to the judge increasing his offer to £185. The offer was accepted by wire on the 19th, and board minutes show the transfer being executed on the 19th of February 1929.
I'm at the southern high point of the island, spot height 128, known as Mistaken Mount, which is the only officially named geographic feature on the island. Whose mistake it is, I'm not quite sure. I asked Land Information New Zealand, who were preparing information for the 250th anniversary of Cook's voyages, and they said it wasn't Cook. The name Mistaken Mount appears on Stokes's chart of 1849-53 from the voyage of the Acheron. It's known that a lot of features were named by the people on that survey, so I expect that they made a mistake and they called this Mistaken Mount. Getting right down to the ground on the top of Mistaken Mount is this 1.5-inch driven iron pipe in fantastic condition. It dates to about 1909, when Morgan Carkeek had the contract to survey D'Urville Island, and he did the outlying islands as well. D'Urville proved to be a bit more difficult than he thought, and he actually ran out of money and his contract was terminated, which might explain why Puangiangi appears pretty much as a sketch. That silly sketch found its way through to the 1929 title and has perpetuated the rather gross inaccuracy in the area of the island, listed as 38 hectares, whereas it's actually 63. The Acheron chart is actually much more close to the truth, dating from over 50 years prior to Carkeek's survey. Morgan Carkeek was the last person purportedly to see the North Island Takahe.
Just before relocating to another point on the island to talk about the King Turner family's tenure. I just wanted to tie up some loose ends about what happened to the people that we've been talking about so far. The wrongs perpetrated against Ngāti Koata in the area were settled in the 2012 treaty settlement, and John Arthur Elkington went on to serve with the 28th Battalion in the Second World War and was killed in the Western Desert in November 1942. His name is on a memorial on the Picton Nelson Road, along with that of LBH Hope, son of Percy Douglas Hope.
It's 1929 and we're on the site of the Bismarck King Turner sheepyards and the later whare cum wool shed, 3 metres by 2, and everything's had macrocarpus fall through it since then, so it's looking a bit full on, I'm afraid. It's time for an ecological stocktake. Farming's been going for 40 years or thereabouts now, so we've had burning of the forest for pastures repeatedly, probably each season, so that the regrowth can be kept away. We've had the regrowth getting grubbed out. Kiori, the small Pacific rat, has been well established for quite a long time now, don't know how long, and by this point has either been eradicated or gradually being supplanted by Norway rats, which I suspect arrived with the start of more intensive farming. What we didn't get were a whole lot of nasty weeds. We've also remained free of stoats so far as we know. Stoats are on adjacent D'Urville Island, but they don't appear to have arrived here during the farming years. One thing that was here is rabbits, and that surprises me a bit because there certainly weren't any when we arrived in 2012. One of the sale documents in the late 1920s referred to the island as Rabbit Island, and indeed it was referred to the same thing in 1957 in a subsequent sale. Ian Atkinson and Rowley Taylor's 1991 report on mammals on islands mentions that Puangiangi once held rabbits, but that they had either died out or been eradicated by the production date of that report. Bismarck King Turner was born in Portage, I believe, and moved as an 18-month-old to Waitata Bay, I think it was, which is inland from French Pass in 1888. He's one of 4 brothers, and descendants recount how the brothers would amuse themselves every few weeks by rowing from Waitata to Havelock for supplies. They'd find a drink and perhaps a fight, and then they'd row home the following day after staying the night in Havelock. So yeah, rough and ready times they were, weren't they? And he was quite a political animal. He wanted to become a Justice of the Peace. And now I'm not here to impugn anyone's reputation, living or dead, but the National Archives state that Mounted Constable Hardy wrote to the people in Wellington, and it even got as far as ministerial level, recommending that Mr. King Turner not be appointed Justice of the Peace as he and his brothers were suspected of stealing sheep. The people in Wellington decided that they didn't need to give a reason why he wasn't appointed Justice of the Peace, and as long as he never found out, they wouldn't get sued for defamation. Bismarck King Turner seems to have shifted his base around the place a little bit, and in the mid to late 1930s appeared to be based at Waiua, which is on the northwestern part of D'Urville Island. They'd come through the Depression, but in 1939 the island was subject to a mortgagee sale. To me, it was a related party transaction because the 1939 purchaser was Bismarck King Turner's middle son, Lewis. One of the descendants says that the mortgage outstanding was in the region of £70. Lewis and his father didn't get on, but they got on well enough that when Lewis volunteered to fight in the Second World War, Father Bismarck came back and looked after the island operations for him. Lewis distinguished himself in the Western Desert in the field artillery, and at one point they captured some German troops, and as they were being marched away to become prisoners of war, one of them inquired, could they please see the automatic 25-pounder? And they said, well, there's no such thing. But it turned out that it was the boys from D'Urville loading the thing so fast that it looked like an automatic to the people being fired on. At one point, part of the gun broke, and Lewis discarded the broken piece and used his arm to load and burnt his arm very badly indeed. He came back from the war, and in 1945 made a sheep dip behind us, and it's got his initials in it, April 1945. I don't know if the whare was built at the same time as the sheep dip, but I wouldn't be surprised. Lewis and Doris's daughter Adrian remembers coming out here as a little girl in about 53, 54 and staying in the whare here while Dad worked on the farming operation, probably shearing, I guess. Adrian wasn't very well. She had whooping cough, and she was probably treated by Auntie, who was the district nurse at the time, King Turner family being very prominent in the area then and now. As the 50s progressed, Lewis wasn't able to shake off his experiences of the war, and eventually on medical advice he was forced to relinquish tenure of the island he liked so much and stay permanently in Nelson. He sold in 1957, and Adrian recalls her mum feeling like the richest woman in Nelson as she walked up Trafalgar Street with £1,000 in her handbag from the sale of Rabbit Island. That buyer was Ross Webber, and there'll be an entirely separate video about him and how the ecology and conservation status of the island developed from 1957. That's it for this video. Thank you very much for watching.